Drumbeat of rain on the tent roof that had lasted through most of the night faded to something softer as Fail approached Savannah's chair. Drumbeat of rain on the tent roof that had lasted through most. Chapter 5. Something strange. Drumbeat of rain on the tent roof that had lasted through most of the night faded to something softer as Fail approached Savannah's chair, a heavily carved and gilded throne placed in the center of the bright layered carpets that made up the tent's floor, with her eyes carefully lowered to avoid offense. Spring had arrived in a rush, but the braziers were unlit, and the morning air held a touch of chill. Curtsying deeply, she presented the ropework silver tray. The Aiel woman took the golden goblet of wine and drank without so much as a glance in her direction, but she gave another deep curtsy before backing away and setting the tray down on the brass-bound blue chest that already held the tall-necked silver wine pitcher and 3 more goblets, then returned to her
Just trying to get this shared out, everyone.
present, standing between the mirrored stand lamps along the red silk tent wall. It was a spacious tent, and tall. No low Aiel tent for Savannah. Often it was hard to see her as Aiel at all. This morning she lounged in a red brocaded silk robe, tied so it gaped nearly to her waist and exposed half her considerable bosom, though she wore enough jeweled necklaces, emeralds and fire drops and opals, ropes of fat pearls, that she came near to being decent. The Aiel did not wear rings, yet Savannah had at least one begemmed ring on every finger. The thick band of gold and fire drops worn over the folded blue silk scarf that held back her waist-long yellow hair had taken on the aspect of a coronet, if not a crown. There was nothing Aiel in that. Fail and the others, 6 women and 5 men, had been wakened in the night to stand beside Savannah's bed. A pair of feather mattresses laid one atop the other, in case the woman woke and wanted something. Was any ruler in the world attended by a dozen servants while she slept? She fought the urge to yawn. Many things might earn punishment, but yawning surely would. Gaishine were supposed to be meek and eager to please, and it seemed that that meant obsequious to the point of groveling. Bane and Chiad, fierce as they were otherwise, seemed to find it easy. Fail did not. In the near month since she was stripped and tied up like a blacksmith's puzzle for hiding a knife, she had been switched 9 times for trivial offenses that were serious in Savannah's eyes. Her last set of welts had not faded completely yet, and she had no intention of earning another set through carelessness. She hoped that Savannah thought her tamed by that night trussed up in the cold. Only Roland and his braziers had saved her life. She hoped that she was not being tamed. Pretend something too long and it could become truth. She had been a prisoner less than 2 months, yet she could no longer recall exactly how many days ago she was captured. At times it seemed she had been in white robes for a year or more. Sometimes the wide belt and collar of flat golden links felt natural. That frightened her. She clung hard to hope. She would escape soon. She had to, before Perrin caught up and tried to rescue her. Why had he not caught up yet? Shido had been camped at Malden for a long time now. He would not have abandoned her. Her wolf would be coming to rescue her. She had to escape before he got himself killed in the attempt, before she was no longer pretending. "How long are you going to keep punishing Galena Sedai, Tharava?" Savannah demanded, frowning at the Aes Sedai. Tharava was seated cross-legged in front of her on a tasseled blue cushion, straight-backed and stern. "Last night she made my bath water too hot, and she is so welted I had to order the soles of her feet beaten. That is not very effective when she must be left able to walk." Fail had been avoiding looking at Galena ever since Tharava brought her into the tent, but her eyes went to the woman of their own accord at mention of her name. Galena was kneeling erect, halfway between the 2 Aiel women and slightly to one side, mottled brown bruises on her cheeks, her skin damp and slick from the heavy rain she had been walked through to get there, her feet and ankles muddy. She wore only her fire-drop-studded golden collar and belt, and seemed more naked than naked. Just a stubble remained of her hair and eyebrows. Every hair from head to toe had been singed from her with the one power. Fail had heard it described, along with how the Aes Sedai had been hung from her ankles for her first beating. That had been half the talk among the Guy Shine for days. Only the handful who recognized her ageless face for what it was could believe that she was Aes Sedai, and some of those had the same doubts that had plagued Fail on finding an Aes Sedai among the Guy Shine.
It's
After
rolling
all,
up
she had
now,
the
y'all.
face and the ring. But why would an Aes Sedai let Thorava treat her so? Fail asked herself that question often without arriving at any answer. She kept telling herself that Aes Sedai often did what they did for reasons no one else could understand, but that was not very satisfying. Whatever her reasons for tolerating such abuse, Galena's eyes were wide and frightened now and fixed on Thorava. She was panting so hard that her breasts heaved. She had reason for fear. Anyone passing Thorava's tent was likely to hear Galena howling for mercy inside. For more than half a week, Fail had gotten glimpses of the Aes Sedai on some errand, hairless and garbed as she was now, and running as hard as she could with panic painting her face. And every day Thorava added to the bands of welt that striped Galena from her shoulders to the backs of her knees. Whenever one band began to heal, Thorava refreshed it. Fail had heard Shido mutter that Galena was being treated too harshly, but no one was about to interfere with a wise one. Thorava, nearly as tall as most Aiel men, adjusted her dark shawl in a rattle of gold and ivory bracelets and regarded Galena like a blue-eyed eagle regarding a mouse. Her necklaces, also gold and ivory, seemed plain compared to Savannah's opulence, her dark woolen skirts and white algoda blouse drab. Yet of the two women, Fail feared Thorava far more than she did Savannah. Savannah might have her punished for a stumble, but Thorava could kill her or crush her for a whim. She surely would for failure. So long as the faintest bruise remains on her face, the rest of her will be bruised as well. I've left the front of her unmarked so she can be punished for other misdeeds. Galena began trembling. Silent tears leaked down her cheeks. Fail averted her gaze. It was painful to watch. Even if she managed to get the rod from Thorava's tent, could the Aes Sedai any longer be of help in escape? She gave every sign of being completely broken. That was a harsh thought, but a prisoner needed to be practical above all else. Would Galena betray her to try buying her way out of the beatings? She had threatened to betray her if Fail failed to obtain the rod. It was Savannah who would be interested in Perrin Abar's wife, yet Galena looked desperate enough to try anything. Fail prayed for the woman to find strength to hold out. She was still planning an escape on her own, in case the Aes Sedai could not keep her promise to take them with her when she
My
left.
last paper.
But it would be so much easier, so much safer for everyone if she could do it. Oh, light! Why had Perrin not caught up yet? No, she had to keep her focus. She is not very impressive like that, Savannah muttered, frowning into her goblet now. Even that ring cannot make her look like an Aes Sedai. She shook her head irritably. For some reason Fail did not understand, it was very important to Savannah that everyone know that Galena was a sister. She'd even taken to giving her the honorific. Why are you here so early, Thorava? I've not even eaten yet. Will you take some wine? Water, Thorava said firmly. As for it being early, the sun is almost over the horizon. I broke fast before it rose. You grow as indolent as a wetlander, Savannah. Lusara, a buxom Damani Guy Shine, quickly filled a goblet from the silver water pitcher. Savannah seemed amused by the wise one's insistence on drinking only water, yet she provided it for them. Anything else would have been an insult, even she would want to avoid. The copper-skinned Domani had been a merchant, and well into her middle years, but a few white hairs among the black falling below her shoulders had not been enough to save her. She was stunningly beautiful, and Savannah gathered the rich, the powerful, and the beautiful, simply taking them if they were Guy Shine to someone else. There were so many Guy Shine that few complained at having one taken. Lusara curtsied.
Hey, John McDonald, how you doing, bro?
To
Just trying to get this joint rolled up, then we'll do a
but on
dab.
the way back to her place against the wall, she smiled at Fail. Worse, it was a conspiratorial smile. Fail suppressed a sigh. Her last switching had been for a sigh at the wrong moment. Lusara was one of those who had sworn fealty to her in the past 2 weeks.
Oh shit, hell yeah, John
After
McDonald.
Arvine, Fail had tried to choose carefully, but rejecting
Hope
someone
it was
who
a
asked
safe
her to
move.
swear was creating a possible betrayer, so she had far too many adherents, a good number of whom she was unsure of. She was beginning to believe that Lusara was trustworthy, or at least that she would not intentionally betray her. But the woman treated their escape plans like a child's game, without cost if they lost. It seemed she had treated merchanting in the same way, making and losing several fortunes. But Fail would have no chance
Give
to
me
start
1
over if
second.
they lost. Nor would Aleandra, or Megden, or Lusara. Among Savannah's Guy Shine, those who actually attempted escape were kept chained when not serving her or performing tasks. Tharava took a swallow of water, then set the goblet down on the flowered carpet beside her and fixed Savannah with a steely gaze. The wise ones believe it is past time for us to move north and east. We can find easily defended valleys in the mountains there, and we can reach them in less than 2 weeks, even slowed as we are by the Guy Shine. This place is open on every side, and our raids to
No
find
shit.
food must go
4
further
trips.
and further.
Oh, so it wasn't too far away.
Savannah's green eyes met that stare without blinking, which Fail doubted
Just
she
do a
herself would
dab.
have done. It nettled Savannah when the other wise ones met without her, and frequently she took it out on her Guy Shine, but she smiled and took a sip of wine before replying in patient tones, as though explaining to someone not quite bright enough to understand. Here, there is good soil for planting, and we have their seed to add to our own. Who knows what the soil is like in the mountains? Our raids bring in cattle and sheep and goats, too. Here there are good pastures. What pasturage do you know of in these mountains, Tharava? Here we have more water than any clan has ever had. Do you know where the water is in the mountains? As to defending ourselves, who will come against us? These wetlanders run from our spears. Not all run, Tharava said dryly. Some are even good at dancing the spears. And what if Randall
No
Thor
shit,
sends
hell
one
yeah.
of the other clans against us?
Always better to go
We would never
solar.
know until the horns closed in on us. Suddenly she smiled too, a smile that never reached her eyes. Some say your plan is to be captured and made Guy Shine to Randall Thor so you can induce him to marry you. An amusing idea. You agree? Despite herself, Fail flinched. Savannah's mad intention to marry Althor, she had to be mad to think she could, was what put Fail in danger from Galena. If the Aiel woman did not know that Perrin was linked to Althor, Galena could tell her, would tell her if she could not get her hands on that cursed rod. Savannah would take no chances on losing her then. She would be chained as certainly as if caught trying to escape. Savannah looked anything except amused. Eyes glittering, she leaned forward, her robe gaping to expose her bosom completely. Who says this? Who? Tharava picked up her goblet and took another swallow of water. Realizing she would get no answer, Savannah leaned back and rearranged her robe. Her eyes still glittered like polished emeralds, though, and there was nothing casual in her words. They came out as hard as I Randall Thor's I almost had him until the wise ones failed me. I will marry him, unite the clans, and conquer all of the wetlands. Tharava sneered over her goblet. Kula did Savannah.
No shit.
I had not found the wise who gave him permission to go to Ruidion.
At least that's all you forgot.
Randall Thor is a creature of the Aes Sedai. They told him what to say at Al Kher Dal, and a black day it was when he revealed secrets few are strong enough to know. Be grateful that most believe he lied. But I forget. You have never gone to Ruidion. You believed his lies yourself. Guyshine began entering past the tent flap, their white robes rain damp, holding their hems knee-high until they were inside. Each wore the golden collar and belt. Their soft white-laced boots left muddy marks on the carpets. Later, when those had dried, they would have to clean them away, but getting visible mud on your robes was a sure path to the switch. Savannah wanted her Guyshine spotless when they were around. Neither Aiel woman paid the slightest attention to the arrivals. Savannah seemed taken aback by what
At least,
Thurava
other
said.
than that, it's a pretty
Well,
smooth
you didn't care who
move.
gave
You
Kulin
can't beat
permission.
that.
No matter, she said, waving a hand as though brushing away a fly when she got no reply. Kuladin is dead. Randall Thor has them markings, however he got them. I will marry him, and I will make use of him. If the Aes Sedai could control him, and I saw them handling him like a babe, then I can. With a little help from you. And you will help. You agreed that uniting the clans is worth doing no matter how it is done. You did once. Somehow there was more than a hint of threat in that. We Shido will become the most powerful of the clans in one leap. Lowering their cowls, the new Gaishain filed wordlessly along the tent walls. 9 men and 3 women. One of them Meg did. The sun-haired woman wore a grim expression that had been on her face since the day Thurava had discovered her in the Wise One's tent. Whatever Thurava had done, all
Excuse me.
Megden would say of it was that she wanted to kill the other woman. Sometimes she whimpered in her sleep, though. Thurava kept whatever she thought about uniting the clans to herself. There is much feeling against staying here. Many of the Sept chiefs press the red disc on their knob every morning. I advise you to That would mean fools or something. But what could this be? Were still teaching her about Aiel ways when they could find time, and they had never mentioned any such thing. Egden stopped beside Lusara. A slender Kyrianan nobleman stopped beside Fail. He was young and very pretty, but he bit his lip nervously. If he learned about the oaths of fealty, he would have to be killed. She was certain he would run to Savannah in a heartbeat. We remain here, Savannah said angrily, flinging her goblet to the carpets in a spray of wine. I speak for the clan chief, and I have spoken. You have spoken, Thurava agreed calmly. Later, the Sept chief of the Green received permission to go to Ruidion. He left 5 days ago with 20 of his Algai de Siswai and 4 wise ones to stand witness. Not until one of the new Gaishain stood beside the already there did Fail and the others raise their cowls and begin filing along the walls toward the door flap, already gathering their robes to the knee. She had become quite sanguine about exposing her legs, so. He seeks to replace me? And I was not even informed? Not you, Savannah. Kula did. As his widow, you speak for the clan chief until a new chief returns from Ruidion, but you are not the clan chief. Fail stepped out into the cold, gray morning drizzle, and the tent flap cut off whatever Savannah said to that. What was going on between the two women? Sometimes, as
You use my
they seemed
little touchstone.
But at others they seemed reluctant conspirators bound together by something that gave neither any comfort. Or perhaps it was the being bound together itself that made them uncomfortable. Well, she could not see how knowing would help her escape, so it did not really matter. But the puzzle nagged at her. 6 maidens stood clustered in front of the tent, veils hanging down onto their chests, spears thrust up through the harness of the bow cases on their backs. Bane and Chiad were contemptuous of Savannah for using maidens of the spear for her guard of honor, though she herself had never been a maiden, and for having her tent always guarded. But there were never fewer than 6, night or day. Those 2 were contemptuous of the Shido maidens for allowing it, too. Neither being a clan chief nor speaking for one gave you as much power as most nobles possess. These maidens' hands were flashing in a rapid conversation. She caught the sign for Karakorin several times, but not sufficient else to make out what they were saying, or whether about Althor or Kuladin. Standing there long enough to find out, if she could find out, was beyond the question. With the others already hurrying away down the muddy street,
Before I like
become
this,
suspicious for one thing.
I'll be right
And
back.
then they might switch her themselves, or worse, use her own bootlaces. She had had a hard dose of that from some maidens for having insolent eyes, and she did not want another, especially when it meant bearing herself in public. Being Savannah's Gaishain gave no protection. Any Shido could discipline any Gaishain they thought was behaving improperly. Even a child could, if the child was set to watch you carry out a chore. For another thing, the cold rain, light as it was going to soak through her woolen robes soon enough. She had only a short walk back to her tent, no more than a quarter of a mile, but she would not complete it without being stopped for a time. A yawn cracked her jaws. She turned from the large red tent. She very much wanted her blankets and a few more hours' sleep. There would be more chores come afternoon. What they might be, she did not know. Matters would be much simpler if Savannah settled on who she wanted to do what when, but she seemed to choose names at random and always at the last minute. It made planning anything, much less the escape, very difficult. All sorts of tents surrounded Savannah's. Low, dark Aiel tents, peaked tents, walled tents, tents of every sort and size in every color imaginable, separated by a tangle of dirt streets that were now rivers of mud. Lacking enough of their own, the Shido snatched up every tent they could find. 14 septs were camped in a sprawl around Malden now, 100,000 Shido and as many Guy Shine, and rumor said 2 more septs, the Morai and the White Cliff, would arrive within days. Aside from small children splashing through the mud with romping dogs, most of the people she could see as she walked wore mud-stained white and were carrying baskets or bulging sacks. Most of the women did not hurry. They ran. Except for the blacksmiths, the Shido seldom did any work themselves, and generally only out of boredom, she suspected. With so many Guy Shine, finding chores for them all was itself a chore. Savannah was no longer the only Shido to actually sit in a bathtub with a Guy Shine scrubbing her back. None of the wise ones had gone that far yet, but some of the others would not stir themselves 2 paces to pick something up when they could tell a Guy Shine to fetch it. She was almost to the Guy Shine portion of the camp, hard against the gray stone walls of Malden, when she saw a wise one striding toward her with her dark shawl wrapped around her head against the rain. Fail did not stop, but she bent her knees a little. Mara was not so frightening as Tharava, but the grim-faced woman was hard enough, and shorter than Fail. Her narrow mouth always grew even tighter when she was confronted with a woman taller than she. Fail would have thought that learning her own sept, the White Cliff, would be there soon, would brighten the woman's mood, but the news had had no discernible effect at all. "So you were just lagging," Mara said as she came close. Her eyes were as hard as the sapphires they resembled. "I left Riala listening to the others because I feared some drunken fool had pulled you into a tent." She glared around her as though looking for a drunken fool about to do just that. "No one accosted me, wise one," Fail said quickly. Several had in the last few weeks, some drunk and some not, but Roland always appeared in the nick of time. Twice the big Meriden had had to fight to save her, and once he had killed the other man. She had expected 9 kinds of uproar and trouble, but the wise ones judged it a fair fight, and Roland said her name had never been mentioned. For all that Bane and Chiad insisted it went against all custom, assault was a constant danger for Guy Shine women here. She was sure that Alejandra had been assaulted once, before she and Megden also acquired Meriden shadows. Roland denied having asked them to help her people. He said they were just bored and looking for something to do. "I'm very sorry I was slow." "Do not cringe. I'm not Tharava. I will not beat you for the pleasure of it." Words said in tones hard enough for a headsman. Mara might not beat people for pleasure, but Fail knew for a fact that she had a strong arm swinging a switch. "Now tell me what Savannah said. This water falling from the sky may be a dangerous thing, but it is miserable to walk around in." Obeying the command, Savannah had not wakened her. Once she did rise, all her clothes and jewels she would wear, especially the jewels. Her jewelry chest had been made to hold clothing, and it was filled to the top with more gems than most queens possessed. Before putting on any garment at all, Savannah had spent time trying on different combinations of necklaces and rings, and studying herself in the gilt-framed stand mirror. It had been very embarrassing for Fail. She had just reached Tharava's arrival with Galena when everything in front of her eyes rippled. She rippled. It was not imagination. Mara's blue eyes followed as far as they could go. with it too. Again, everything rippled, including herself, harder than before. In shock, Fail stood up straight and let go of her robe. A third time, the world rippled harder still, and as it passed through her, she felt as if she might blow away in a breeze or simply dissipate in a mist. Breathing hard, she waited for the fourth ripple, the one she knew would destroy her and everything else. When it did not come, she expelled every bit of air in her lungs from relief. What just happened, wise one? What was that? Era touched her own arm, surprised that her hand did not pass through flesh and bone. I don't know, she said slowly. Giving herself a shake, she added, "Go on about your business, girl." She gathered her skirts and strode past Fail at little short of a trot, splashing mud as she went. The children had vanished from the street, but Fail could hear them wailing inside the tents. Abandoned dogs shivered and whined, tails tucked between their legs. People in the street were touching themselves, touching each other, Shido and Guy Shine alike. Fail clasped her hands together. Of course she was solid. She had only felt as though she were turning to mist. Of course. Hoisting her robes to avoid any more washing than she absolutely had to do, she began to walk, and then to run, careless of how much mud she splashed onto herself or anyone else. She knew there could be no running from another of those ripples, but she ran anyway, as fast as her legs could carry her. The Geishheim tents made a broad ring around Malden's high granite walls, and they were as varied as the tents in the outer part of the encampment, though most were small. Her own peaked tent could have slept too, uncomfortably. It housed herself and three others, Aleandra, May, and a former Kyrian and noblewoman named Diraine, one of those who curried favor with Savannah by carrying tales about the other Geishheim. That complicated matters, but there was no mending it short of killing the woman, and Fail would not countenance that. Not unless Diraine became a real threat. They slept huddled together like puppies of necessity, glad of the shared body warmth on cold nights. The interior of the low tent was dim when she ducked inside. Lamp oil and candles were in short supply, and not wasted on Geishheim. Only Aleandra was there, lying face down on her blankets in her collar with a damp cloth dipped in an herbal infusion over her bruised bottom. At least the wise ones were as willing to give their healing herbs to Geishheim as to Shido. Aleandra had done nothing wrong, but had been named as one of the 5 who had pleased Savannah least yesterday. Unlike some, she had done quite well while being punished. Dormanas had begun weeping even before he was bent over the chest, but she seemed to be among those chosen out every 3 or 4 days. Being a queen did not teach you how to serve a queen. But then Magdalene was picked nearly as often, and she was a lady's maid, if not a very skilled one. Fail herself had only been chosen once. It was a measure of how Aleandra's spirits had fallen that she made no move to cover herself, only raised up on her elbows. Still, she had combed her long hair. If she failed to do that, Fail would know the woman had reached bottom. "Did anything strange happen to you just now, my lady?" she asked, fear strong in her unsteady voice. "It did," Fail said, standing crouched under the ridgepole. "I don't know what it was. Mara doesn't know what it was. I doubt any of the wise ones do. But it didn't harm us." "Of course it did not harm them. Of course not. And it changes nothing in our plans." Yawning, she unfastened the wide golden belt and dropped it on her blankets, then grasped her outer robe to pull it over her head. Aleandra put her head down on her hands and began weeping quietly. "We'll never escape. I'm going to be beaten again tonight. I know it. I'm going to be beaten every day for the rest of my life." With a sigh, Fail left her outer robe where it was and knelt to stroke her liege woman's hair. There were as many responsibilities down as up. "I have those same fears now and then," she admitted softly, "but I refuse to let them take control. I will escape. We will escape." You have to keep your courage, Alejandra. I know you're brave. I know you've dealt with Messina and kept your nerve. You can keep it now if you try. Aravine put her head in at the tent flap. She was a plain, plump woman. A noble, Fail was sure, though she never claimed it, and despite the dimness, Fail could see that she was beaming. She wore Savannah's belt and collar,
Sorry,
too.
everyone. Just doing a
My
game
lady,
real quick.
Alvan and his son have something for you. It will have to wait a few minutes, Fail said. Alejandra had stopped crying, but she was just lying there, silent and still. My lady, you won't want to wait for this. Fail's breath caught. Could it be possible? It seemed too much to hope for. I can keep my nerve, Alejandra said, raising her head to gaze at Aravine. If what Alvan has is what I hope it is, I'll keep my nerve if Savannah has me put to the question. Snatching up her belt, being seen outside without belt and collar both meant punishment almost as severe as for trying to run away. Fail hurried out of the tent. The drizzle had slackened to the rain, but she pulled up her cowl anyway. The rain was still cold. Alvan was a stocky man, overtopped by his son Ferrell, a lanky boy. Both wore mud-stained, almost white robes made of tent cloth. Ferrell, Alvan's eldest, was only 14, but the Shido had not believed it because of his height, as much as most men in Amadisia. Fail had been ready to trust Alvan from the start. He and his son were something of legends among the Gaishain. 3 times they had run away, and each time it had taken the Shido longer to bring them back. And despite increasingly fierce punishment, on the day they swore fealty, they had been planning a 4th attempt to return to the rest of their family. Neither ever smiled that Fail had seen, but today smiles wreathed Alvan's weathered face and Ferrell's skinny one alike. What do you have for me? Fail asked, hastily fastening her belt around her waist. She thought her heart was going to pound its way out of her chest. It was my Ferrell, my lady, Alvan said. A woodcutter, he spoke with a coarse accent that made him barely intelligible. He was just walking by, see, and there was nobody around. Nobody at all. So he ducked in quick-like and, show the lady, Ferrell. Shyly, Ferrell reached into his wide sleeve. The robes usually had pockets sewn in there, and drew out a smooth white rod that looked like ivory, about a foot long and as slim as her wrist. Looking around to see if anyone was watching, the street was empty save for them, for the moment at least. Fail took it quickly and pushed it up her own sleeve to tuck into the pocket there. The pocket was just deep enough to keep it from falling out, but now that she had the thing in hand, she did not want to let go of it. It felt like glass, and was distinctly cool to the touch, cooler than the morning air. Perhaps it was an angreal, or a turangreal. That would explain why Galena wanted it, if not why she had not taken it herself. And buried in her sleeve, Fail gripped the rod hard. Galena was no longer a threat. Now she was salvation. You understand, Alvan, that Galena may be unable to take you and your son with her when she leaves, she said. She has only promised that to me and those captured with me. But I promise you that I will find a way to free you and everyone who has sworn to me. All the rest, too, if I can, but those above all. Under the light and by my hope of salvation and rebirth, I swear it. How, she had no idea, short of calling on her father for an army, but she would do it. The woodcutter made as if to spit, then glanced at her, and his face colored. He swallowed instead. That Galena ain't going to help nobody, m'lady. Says she's Aista and all, but she's that Tharava's plaything, if you ask me. And that Tharava ain't never going to let her go. Anyways, I know if we can get you free, you'll come back for the rest of us. No need for you to swear and all that. You said you wanted the rod if anybody could lay hands on it without getting caught, and Thurl got it for you, that's all. I want to be free, Thurl said suddenly. But if we get anybody free, then we've beaten them. He looked surprised that he had spoken, and blushed deep red. His father frowned at him, then nodded thoughtfully. Very well said, Fail told the boy gently. But I made my oath, and I stand by it. You and your father... She cut off as Aravine, looking past her shoulder, laid a hand on her arm. The woman's smile had been replaced by fright. Turning her head, Fail saw Roland standing beside her tent. A good 2 hands taller than Perrin, he wore his shufa coiled around his neck, with the black veil hanging down his broad chest. Rain slicked his face and made his short red hair cling to his scalp in curls. How long had he been there? Not long, or Aravine would have noticed him before. The tiny tent offered little concealment. Alban and his son had their shoulders hunched, as if they were thinking about attacking the tall Meriden. That was a very bad idea. Mice attacking a cat was not in it, as Perrin would have said. Go on about your duties, Alban, she said quickly. You too, Aravine. Go on now. Aravine and Alban had sense enough not to offer courtesies before leaving with final worried glances at Roland, but Thurl half raised a hand toward knuckling his forehead before catching himself. Blushing, he scurried away after his father. Roland came out from beside the tent to stand in front of her. Oddly, he had a small bunch of blue and yellow wildflowers in one hand. She was very conscious of the rod she was holding in her sleeve. Where was she to hide it? Once the Rabbit discovered it missing, she likely would turn the camp upside down. You must be careful, Fail Bashir, Roland said, smiling down at her. Alejandra called him not quite pretty, but Fail had decided she was wrong. Those blue eyes and that smile made him very nearly beautiful. What you are about is dangerous, and I may not be here to protect you much longer. Dangerous? She felt a chill in her middle. What do you mean? Where are you going? The thought of losing his protection made her stomach lurch. Few of the Wetlander women had escaped the attentions of Shido men. Without him, some of us are thinking of returning to the Threefold Land. His smile faded. We cannot follow a false Skarakhan, and a Wetlander at that. But perhaps we will be allowed to live out our lives in our own homes. We think on it. We have been a long time from home, and these Shidos sicken us. She would find a way to deal with it once he was gone. She would have to, somehow. And what am I doing that is dangerous? She tried to make her voice light, but it was difficult. Light. What would happen to her without him?
What the fuck?
These Shido are blind even when they are not drunk, Fail Bashir, he replied calmly. Pushing her cowl back, he tucked one of the wildflowers into her hair above her left ear. We Meriden use our eyes. Another wildflower went into her hair on the other side. You have made many new friends lately, and you are planning to escape with them. A bold plan, but dangerous. And will you tell the wise ones, or Savannah? She was startled when that came out in an even tone. Her stomach was trying to tie itself into knots. Why would I do that? He asked, adding another flower to her decorations. Jordan thinks he will take Lucille Aldorwin back to the Threefold Land with him, even if she is a tree killer. He believes he may convince her to make a bridal wreath to lay at his feet. Lucille had found her own protector by climbing into the blankets of the Meriden who had made her guy shine, and Arla had done the same with one of the maidens who had captured her, but Fail doubted that Jordan would attain his wish. Both women were focused on escape like arrows aimed at a target. And now that I think on it, I may take you with me if we go. Fail stared up at him. The rain was beginning to soak through her hair. To the waist? Roland, I love my husband. I've told you that, and it is true. I know, he said, continuing to add flowers. But for the moment you still wear white. And what happens while you wear white is forgotten when you put it off. Your husband cannot hold it against you. Besides, if we go, when we come near a Wetlander town, I will let you go. I should never have made you guy shine in the first place. That collar and belt hold enough gold to get you safely back to your husband. Her mouth fell open in shock. It surprised her when her fist struck his wide chest. Shine were never allowed to offer violence, but the man just grinned at her. You! She struck him again, harder. She beat at him. You! I can't think of a word bad enough. You let me think you were going to abandon me to these Shido while all along you were meaning to help me escape? Finally, he caught her fist and held it easily with a hand that enveloped hers completely. If we go, Fail Bashir, he laughed. The man laughed. It is not decided. Anyway, a man cannot let a woman think he's too eager. Again, she surprised herself, this time by beginning to laugh and cry at the same time, so hard that she had to lean against him or fall down. That bloody Aiel sense of humor. You are very beautiful with flowers in your hair, Fail Bashir, he murmured, tucking in another blow. Or without them. And for the moment, you still wear white. Fight.
Oh, my back.
She had the rod, leaning against her arm so coolly, but there was no way to give it to Galena until Tharaba let her walk around freely again. No way to be sure that the woman would not betray her before then out of desperation. Roland offered her escape, if the Meriden decided to leave, but he would continue to try to inveigle her into his blanket so long as she wore white. And if the Meriden decided not to go, would one of them betray her escape plans? If Roland could be believed, they all knew. Hope and danger all tied together inextricably. What a tangle. She turned out to have been exactly right about Tharaba's reaction. Just before midday, all of the Gaishine were herded into the open and made to strip to their skins. Covering herself as best she could with her hands, together with other women wearing Savannah's belt. They had been made to put those on again straight away. Huddled for a scrap of decent Shido rummaged through the Gaishine, tossing everything out into the mud. All Fail could do was think about her hiding place inside the town and pray. Hope and danger, and no way to untangle them.
Chapter 6. A Stave and a Razor. Matt had never really expected Luca to leave Jurador after only one day. The stone-walled salt town was wealthy, and Luca did like to see coin stick to his hands. So he was not exactly disappointed when the man told him that Valan Luca's grand traveling show and magnificent display of marvels and wonders would remain there at least 2 more days. Not exactly disappointed, yet he had hoped that his luck might hold toward his being Taviran. But then, being Taviran had never brought anything other than bad that he could see. The lines at the entrance are already as long as they were at their best yesterday, Luca said, gesturing expansively. They were inside Luca's huge, gaudy wagon early on the morning after Rena's death, and the tall man sat in the gilded chair at the narrow table, a real table with stools tucked under for guests. Most other wagons had an affair rigged on ropes from the ceiling, and people sat on the beds to eat. Luca had not yet donned one of his flamboyant coats, but he made up for it with gestures. Littell, his wife, was cooking the breakfast porridge on a small iron-topped brick stove built into a corner of the windowless wagon, and the air was sharp with spices. The harsh-faced woman put so many spices in it that it was all inedible. Luca always gobbled down whatever she set in front of him, as if it were a feast. He must have a leather tongue. I expect twice as many visitors today, maybe 3 times as many, and tomorrow as well. People can't see everything in one visit, and here they can afford to come twice. Word of mouth, Cawthon, word of mouth. That brings as many as Aludra's night flowers. I feel almost like Taviran, the way things are falling out. Large audiences and the prospect of more. A warrant protection from the High Lady. Luca cut off abruptly, looking faintly embarrassed as if he had just remembered that Matt's name was on that warrant as being excluded from protection. You might not like it if you really were Taviran, Matt muttered, which made the other man give him an odd look. He put a finger behind the black silk scarf that hid his hanging scar and tugged at it. For a moment, the thing had felt too tight. He had spent a night of bleak dreams about corpses floating downstream and woken to the dice spinning in his head. Always a bad sign, and now they seem to be bouncing off the inside of his skull harder than before. I can pay you as much as you'll make for every show you give between here and Lugard, no matter how many people attend. That's on top of what I promised for carrying us to Lugard. If the show was not stopping all the time, they could cut the time to reach Lugard by 3/4 at the least. More if he could convince Luca to spend whole days on the road instead of half days the way they did now. Luca seemed taken with the idea, nodding thoughtfully, but then he shook his head with a sadness that was plainly feigned and spread his hands. And what will that look like? A traveling show that never stops to give shows? It will look suspicious, that's what. I have the warrant, and the High Lady will speak up for me besides. But you certainly don't want to pull the Shonchan down on us. No, it's safer for us this way. The man was not thinking of Matt Cawthon's bloody safety. He was thinking that his bloody shows might earn him more than Matt paid. That, plus making himself as much the center of attention as any of the performers, was nearly as important to him as gold. Some of the show folk talked of what they would do when they retired. Not Luca. He intended to keep on until he fell over dead in the middle of a show, and he would arrange it so he had the largest audience possible when he did. It's ready, Fallon, Littell said affectionately as she lifted the iron pot from the stove with a cloth protecting her hands and set it down on a thick woven mat on the table. 2 places had already been set, with white glazed plates and silver spoons. Luca would have silver spoons when everyone else settled for tin or pot metal or even horn or wood. Stern-eyed, with a hard set to her mouth, the bear trainer looked quite odd wearing a long white apron over her spangled blue dress. Her bears probably wished they had trees to climb when she frowned at them. Strangely, though, she jumped to ensure her husband's comforts. Will you be eating with us, Master Cawthon? There was no welcome in that. In fact, just the opposite, and she showed no sign of turning to the cupboard where the plates were stored. Matt gave her a bow that soured her face further. He had never been less than civil to the woman, but she refused to like him. I thank you for the kind invitation, Mistress Luca, but no, she grunted. So much for being courteous. He put on his flat-brimmed hat and left, the dice rattling away. Luca's big wagon, glittering in red and blue and covered with golden stars and comets, not to mention the phases of the moon in silver, stood in the middle of the show, as far as possible from the animals' smelly cages and the horse lines. It was surrounded by smaller wagons, little houses on wheels, most windowless and most painted just a single color with none of Luca's extra decorations, and by wall tents, the size of small houses in blue or green or red, sometimes striped. The sun stood nearly its own height above the horizon in a sky where a sprinkling of white clouds drifted slowly, and children ran playing with hoops and balls, while the show folk were limbering up for their morning performances, men and women twisting and stretching, many with glittering, colorful spangles on their coats or dresses. 4 contortionists in filmy trousers tied at the ankle, and blouses thin enough to leave little to the imagination, made him wince. 2 were sitting on their own heads atop blankets spread on the ground beside their red tent, while the others had twisted themselves into a pair of knots that looked beyond untying. Their backbones must have been made of spring wire. Petra, the strong man, stood bare-chested beside the green wagon he shared with his wife, warming up by lifting weights with either hand that Matt was not sure he could have lifted with both. The man had arms thicker than Matt's legs, and he was not sweating at all. Chlorine's dogs stood in a line at the steps of the wagon, wagging their tails and eagerly waiting on their trainer. Unlike Littell's bears, Matt figured the plump woman's dogs performed so they could make her smile. He was always tempted to just sit quietly somewhere when the dice were clicking in his head, someplace nothing seemed likely to happen, waiting for the dice to stop. And though he would have enjoyed watching some of the female acrobats, a number of whom were as little as the contortionists, he set out to walk the half-mile to Jurador, eyeing everyone on the wide, hard-packed clay road closely. There was a purchase he hoped to make. People were coming to join the long line waiting behind a stout rope stretched along the show's tall canvas wall, only a handful with more than a touch of embroidery on the women's dresses or the men's short coats, and a few farmers' high-wheeled carts lumbering behind a horse or an ox. Figures moved among the small forest of windmills that pumped the salt wells in the low hills behind the town, and around the long evaporation pans. A merchant's train of canvas-covered wagons, 20 of them behind 6-horse teams, rumbled out of the town gates as he approached, the merchant herself in a bright green cloak seated beside the driver of the first wagon. A flock of crows cawed past overhead, giving him a chill, but no one vanished before his eyes, and everybody cast a long shadow so far as he could make out. There were no dead people's shades walking the road today, although he was convinced that was what he had seen the day before. The dead walking surely could mean nothing good. Very likely it had something to do with Tarmangaita and Rand. Colors whirled in his brain, and for an instant in his head he saw Rand and Min standing beside a large bed, kissing. He stumbled and nearly tripped over his own boots. They had not been wearing any clothes. He would have to be careful thinking about Rand. The colors swirled and resolved for a moment, and he stumbled again. There were worse things to spy on than kissing. Very careful what he thought. Light. The pair of guards leaning on their halberds at the iron-studded gates, hard-faced men in white breastplates and conical white helmets with horsetail crests, eyed him suspiciously. They probably thought he was drunk. A reassuring nod failed to change their expressions by a hair. He could have used a stiff drink right then. The guards did not try to stop him entering, though, just watched him pass. Drunks caused trouble, especially a man who was drunk this early in the day, but a drunk in a good coat, plain but well cut and good silk, a man with a little lace at his wrists, was an altogether different matter. The stone-paved streets of Jurador were noisy even at this hour, with hawkers carrying trays or standing behind barrows crying their wares, and shopkeepers beside narrow tables in front of their shops bellowing the fineness of their goods, and coopers hammering hoops onto barrels for shipping salt. The clatter of rug-makers' looms nearly drowned out the ringing of the occasional blacksmith's hammer, not to mention the music of flutes and drums and dulcimers drifting from inns and taverns. It was a jumble of a town, with shops and houses and inns, cheek by jowl with taverns and stables, all of stone and roofed with reddish tiles. A solid town, Jurador, and one accustomed to thievery. Most windows on the lower floors were covered with stout screens of wrought iron. The upper windows as well on the homes of the wealthy, most of whom were no doubt salt merchants. The music of the inns and taverns pulled at him. Likely there would be dice games going on in most of them. He could almost feel
Well, that's
those
pretty much
dice
what you're left
spinning
with.
across the table. It had been too long since he had rattled a set of dice in his hands instead of inside his head, but he was not there for gambling this morning. He had had no breakfast yet, so he approached a wrinkled woman with a tray hung from a strap around her neck, who shouted, "Meat pies made from the finest beef to be found in Altara." He took her word for it and handed over the coppers she demanded. He had seen no cattle at any farms near Jurador, only sheep and goats, but it was best not to inquire too closely what was in a pie bought on the streets of any town. There could be cows on nearby farms. There could be. In any case, the meat pie was tasty and still hot for a wonder, and he walked on along the crowded street, juggling the pie and wiping greasy juice from his chin. He was careful not to bump into anyone in the throng. Altarans were a touchy lot, by and large. In this town, you could tell somebody's station to within a whisker by the amount of embroidery on coat or dress or cloak, the more the higher, long before you were close enough to tell wool from silk. Though the richer women covered their olive-skinned faces with transparent veils hung from ornate combs, stuck into their tightly coiled braids. But men and women alike, whether salt merchants or ribbon hawkers, wore long belt knives with curved
We'll be right back,
blades,
everyone.
sometimes vaunted the hilts as though looking for a fight. He always tried to avoid fighting, though his luck seldom did him much good there. De Viren took over with that, it seemed. The dice had never before signaled the fight. Battles, yes, but never a dust-up in the street. Yet he walked very carefully indeed. Not that that would help, of course. When the dice stopped, they stopped, and that was that. But he saw no reason to take chances. He hated taking chances. Except with gambling, of course, and that was hardly taking a chance for him. He spotted a barrel full of thick quarterstaffs and walking staffs in front of a shop displaying swords and daggers under the watchful eye of a bulky fellow with sunken knuckles, a nose that had been broken more than once, and a thick truncheon hanging at his belt beside the inevitable dagger. The man announced in a rough voice that all the blades on display were Andoran made, But anybody who did not make his own blades always claimed they were Andron, or else from the borderlands, or Tyrant sometimes. Here made good steel. To Matt's surprise and delight, Slim's stave of what appeared to be black yew, more than a foot taller than he was, stood upright in the barrel. Pulling the stave out, he checked the fine, almost braided grain. It was black yew all right. That braided grain was what gave bows made from it such power, twice what any other wood could give. You could never be sure until you started slicing away the excess, but the stave looked perfect. How in the light had black yew come to be in southern Altara? He was sure it only grew in the Two Rivers. When the proprietor came out, a sleek woman with bright feathered birds embroidered to below her bosom, and began extolling the virtues of her blades, he said, "How much for this black stick, mistress?" She blinked, startled that a man in silken lace wanted a quarterstaff. Slim as it was, she thought the thing was a bloody quarterstaff, and named a price that he paid without bargaining, which made her blink again and frown as if she thought she should have asked more. He would have paid more for the makings of a Two Rivers bow. With the raw bow stave over his shoulder, he walked on, wolfing down the last of the meat pie and wiping his hand on his coat. But he had not come for breakfast or a bow stave any more than for gambling. It was the stables that interested him. Livery stables always had a horse or three for sale, and if the price was right, they would usually sell one that had not been for sale. At least they did when the Seanchan had not snapped them up already. Luckily, the Seanchan presence in Jurador had been fleeting so far. He wandered from stable to stable, examining bays and roans, blue roans and piebalds, duns, sorrels, blacks, whites, grays, and dapples, all mares or geldings. A stallion would not serve his purposes. Not every animal he looked at had a shallow girth or long cannons, yet none matched what he had in mind, until he entered a narrow stable jammed between a large stone inn called the 12 Salt Wells and a rug maker's shop. He would have thought the racket and looms would have bothered the horses, but they were all quiet, apparently accustomed to the noise. Stalls stretched farther into the block than he had expected, but lanterns hanging from the stall posts gave a fair light away from the doors. The air, speckled with dust from the loft above, smelled of hay and oats and horse dung, but not old dung. 3 men with shovels were mucking out stalls. The owner kept his place clean. That meant less chance of disease. Some stables he had walked out of after getting one whiff. The black and white mare was out of her stall on a rope halter while a groom put down fresh straw, and she stood squarely, and with her ears perked forward, showing alertness. About 15 hands tall, she was long in front, with a deep girth that promised endurance, and her legs were perfectly proportioned, with short cannons and a good angle to her fetlocks. Her shoulders were well sloped, and her croup dead level with her withers. She had lines as good as Pip's, or even better. More than that, she was a breed he had heard tell of, but never thought to see. A razor from Aradoman. No other breed would have that distinctive coloring. In her coat, black met white in straight lines that could have been sliced by a razor, hence the name. Her presence here was as mystifying as the black yew. He had always heard no money would sell a razor to any outlander. He let his eyes sweep past her without lingering, studying the other animals in their stalls. Had the dice inside his head slowed? No, it was imagination. He was sure they were spinning as hard as they had in Luca's wagon. A wiry man with only a fringe of gray hair remaining came forward, ducking his head over folded hands. "Oak Fairnham, my lord," he introduced himself in rough accents, eyeing the bow stave on Matt's shoulder dubiously. Men who wore silk coats and gold signet rings rarely carried such things. "How can I be of service? My lord wishes to rent a horse or to buy?" Embroidery, small bright flowers, covered the shoulders of the vest he wore over a shirt that might have been white once. Matt avoided looking at the flowers at all. The fellow had one of those curved knives at his belt and 2 long white scars on his leathery face. Old scars. The fighting he had done lately had not marked him where it showed. "Buy, Master Fearnham, if you have anything for sale. If I can find one that's halfway decent." I've had more spavined glue baits offered to me as 6-year-olds when they were 18 if a day than I can shake a stick at. He hefted the bow stave slightly with a grin. His dog claimed bargaining went better if you could make the other fellow start grinning. I have 3 for sale, my lord. None of them spavined, the wiry man replied with another bow and no hint of a grin. Fearnham gestured. One is out of her stall there, 5 years old and prime horseflesh, my lord, and a steal at 10 crowns. Gold, he added blandly. Matt let his jaw drop. For a piebald? I know the Shawnshin have driven prices up, but that's ridiculous. Oh, she's not your common piebald, my lord. A razor is what she is. Damani bloodborne ride razors. Blood and bloody ashes. So much for catching a bargain. So you say, Matt muttered, lowering one end of the bow stave to the stone floor so he could lean on it. His hip seldom bothered him any longer, except when he did a lot of walking, but he had done so this morning and he felt twinges. Well, bargain or no, he had to play out the game. There were rules to horse trading. Break them, and you were asking to have your purse emptied out. I've never heard of any horse called a razor myself. What else do you have? Only geldings or mares, mind. Geldings are all I have for sale, except the razor, my lord. Fearnham said, emphasizing the word razor a little. Turning toward the back of the stable, he shouted, Adela, bring out that big bay, what's for sale? A lanky young woman with a pimply face, in breeches and a plain dark vest, came darting out of the back of the stable to obey. Fearnham had Adela walk the bay, and then a dappled gray on rope leads in the good light near the doors. Matt had to hand him that. Their conformation was not bad at all, but the bay was too big, better than 17 hands, and the gray kept his ears half laid back and tried to bite Adela's hand twice. She was deft with the animals, though, easily evading the bad-tempered gray's lunges. Projecting a pair of them would have been easy if he had not had his mind set on the razor. A lean, gray-striped tomcat, like a ridge cat in miniature, appeared and sat at Fearnham's feet to lick a bloody gash on his shoulder. Rats are worse this year than I ever recalled, the stable-keeper muttered, frowning down at the cat. They fight back more, too. I'm going to have to get another cat, or maybe 2. He brought himself back to the business at hand. Will my lord take a look at my prize, since the others don't suit? I suppose I could look at the piebald, Master Fearnham, Matt said doubtfully, but not for any 10 crowns. In gold, Fearnham said. Herd, walk the razor for the lord here. He emphasized the breed again. Working the man down would be difficult, unless he got some help for a change from being Taviran. His luck never helped with anything as straightforward as dickering. Herd was the fellow refreshing the straw in the razor's stall, a squat man who had about 3 white hairs left on his head and no teeth in his mouth at all. That was evident when he grinned, which he did while he led the mare in a circle. He clearly liked the animal, and well he should. She walked well, but Matt still inspected her closely. Her teeth, said Fearnham, had been honest enough about her age. Only a fool lied very far about a horse's age unless the buyer was a fool himself, though it was surprising how many sellers thought buyers were all just that. And her ears pricked toward him when he stroked her nose, blinking her eyes. They were clear and bright, free of rheum. He felt along her legs without finding any heat or swelling. There was never a hint of a lesion or sore, or of ringworm anywhere on her. He could get his fist easily between her rib cage and her elbow. She would have a long stride, and was barely able to fit his flat hand between her last rib and the point of her hip. She would be hardy, unlikely to strain
I have to
temper,
eventually clean my pipe. Keeps leaking.
The Lord knows his horseflesh, I see. That I do, Master Fearnham. And 10 crowns gold is too much, especially for a piebald. Some say they're bad luck, you know. Not that I believe it, not as such, or I wouldn't offer at all. Bad luck? I never heard that, my lord. What do you offer? I could get Tyrant bloodstock for 10 crowns gold. Not the best, true, but still Tyrant. I'll give you 10 crowns in silver. Fearnham threw back his head, laughing uproariously, and when he stopped, they settled down to the dickering. In the end, Matt handed over 5 crowns in gold, along with 4 marks gold and 3 crowns silver, all stamped in Ebudar. There were coins from many countries in the chest under his bed, but foreign coin usually meant finding a banker or money changer to weigh them and work out what they were worth locally. Aside from attracting more notice than he wanted, he would have ended paying more for the
Gotta
animal,
clean the screen.
maybe even the full 10 crowns gold. Money changers' scales always seemed to work that way. He had not expected to get the man down that far, but from Fearnham's expression, grinning at last, he had never expected to receive so much. It was the best way for horse trading to end, both sides thinking they had come out ahead. All in all, the day had begun very well. Dice are no bloody dice. He should have known it would not last. When he got back to the show at midday, riding the Razor bareback because of his aching hip, and with the dice rattling in his head, the line of people was longer than when he had left, waiting to pass beneath the big blue banner stretched between 2 tall poles that carried the show's name in big red letters. As people dropped their coins into the clear glass pitcher,
Have to
held
get
by
more
a
rolling
heavy-set horse
papers.
handler in a rough woolen coat, to be poured from there into an iron-bound
Lost
chest
my
under the
jobs.
watchful eyes of another horse handler, who was even larger,
Or out of my
people joined
jobs.
the line, so it never seemed to grow shorter. The thing stretched beyond the end of the rope and around the corner. For a small wonder, no one was pushing or shoving. There were obvious farmers in the line, wearing rough woolens and with dirt ingrained in their hands, though the children's faces, and those of the farm wives at least, had been scrubbed clean. Luca was getting his hoped-for crowd, unfortunately. No chance of convincing him to leave tomorrow now. The dice said something was going to happen, something fateful to Matt Bloody Cawthon, but what? There had been times when the dice stopped, and he still had no idea what happened. Just inside the canvas wall, with people streaming past to enjoy the performers lining both sides of the main street, Aludro was taking delivery of 2 wagon loads of barrels in various sizes. Of more than the barrels, it seemed. "I will show you where to park the wagons," the slender woman told the driver of the lead wagon, a lean man with a jutting jaw. Aludra's waist-long beaded braids swung as her eyes followed Matt for a moment, but she quickly turned back to the wagon driver. "The horses you will take to the horse lines afterward, yes?" Now, what had she bought in such quantity? Something for her fireworks, certainly. Every night, soon after dark, so she would catch everyone before they went to bed, she launched her night flowers, 2 or 3 for a town the size of Jurador, or if there were several villages close together. He had had some thoughts on why she wanted a bell founder, but the only one that seemed to make any sense actually made no sense at all that he could see. He hid the mare on the horse lines. Well, you could not really hide a razor, but a horse was noticed less among horses, and the time was not right yet. The bostave he left in the wagon he shared with Aginan and Doman, neither of whom was there, then headed for Tuon's faded purple wagon. That was parked not far from Luca's wagon now, though Matt wished it had been left near the storage wagons. Only Luca and his wife knew that Tuon was a high lady rather than a servant to expose Matt and Aginan to her supposed husband as lovers, but many among the showfolk were already wondering why Matt spent more time with Tuon than with Aginan. Wondering and disapproving. They were an oddly prim lot for the most part, even the contortionists. Running off with the wife of a cruel lord was romantic. Canoodling with the lady's maid was sordid. Giving Tuon's wagon this favored spot among the people who had been with Luca for years and were his most prized performers was going to cause more talk. In truth, he hesitated about going to Tuon at all with the dice drumming in his head. They had stopped too often in her presence, and he still did not know the why for a single one of those times. Not for certain. Maybe the first time it had just been meeting her. Thinking of it made the hair on the back of his neck want to stand up. Still, with women, you always had to take chances. With a woman like Tuon, 10 chances a day, and never knowing the odds until it was too late. Sometimes he wondered why his luck failed to help him more with women. Women were certainly as unpredictable as any honest dice ever made. None of the Red Arms was on guard outside the wagon. They were beyond that now. So he trotted up the short flight of steps at the back of the wagon and rapped once before pulling the door open and entering. After all, he paid the rent for the thing, and they were hardly likely to be lying around unclothed at this time of day. Anyway, the door had a latch if they needed to keep people out. Mistress Annan was off somewhere, but the interior was still crowded. The narrow table had been let down on ropes from the ceiling, with mismatched plates of bread and olives and cheese laid out on it, along with one of Luca's tall silver wine pitchers, a squat red-striped pitcher, and flower-painted cups. Tuan, a month's growth of tightly curled black hair on her head, sat on the wagon's sole stool at the far end of the table, with Solutia sitting on one of the beds at her side, and Noel and Olver on the other bed, elbows on the table. Today, Solutia was in the dark blue Ebudari dress that displayed her memorable bosom so well, with a flowered scarf tied around her head, but Tuan wore a red dress that seemed to be made entirely of tiny pleats. Like he'd only bought her the silk yesterday. How had she convinced the show's seamstresses to complete a dress already? He was pretty certain that usually took longer than a day.
Excuse me.
Promises of his gold, he suspected. Well, if you bought a woman's silk, you had to expect to pay to have it sewn. He had heard that saying as a boy, when he never expected to be able to afford silk, but it was the light's own truth. Only the women are ever seen outside their villages, Noel was saying, but the gnarled, white-haired old man cut off when Matt entered the wagon, pulling the door shut behind him. The scraps of lace at Noel's wrists had seen better days, as had his well-cut coat of fine gray wool, but both were clean and neat, though in truth they looked odd with his crooked fingers and battered face. Those belonged to an aging tavern tough, one who had gone on fighting long past his prime. Olver, in the good blue coat Matt had made for him, grinned as widely as an oak ear. Liked he was a good boy, but he would never be handsome with those big ears and that wide mouth. His manner with women needed vast improvement if he was ever to have any luck there at all. Matt had been trying to spend more time with Olver to get him away from the influence of his uncles, Bannon and Harnan, and the other Red Arms, and the boy seemed to enjoy that. Just not as much as he enjoyed playing snakes and foxes or stones with Tuan and staring at Selutia's bosom. It was all very well for those fellows to teach Olver how to shoot a bow and use a sword and the like, but if Matt ever learned who was teaching him to leer... Manners, toy, Tuan drawled like honey sliding out of a dish. Hard honey. Around him, unless they were playing stones, her expression was usually severe enough for a judge handing down a death sentence, and her tone matched it. You knock, then wait for permission to enter. Unless you are property or a servant, then you do not knock. You also have grease on your coat. I expect you to keep yourself clean. Olver's grin faded at hearing Matt admonished. Noel raked bent fingers through his long hair and sighed, then began studying the green plate in front of him as if he might find an emerald among the olives. Grim tone or no grim tone, Matt enjoyed looking at the dark little woman who was to be his wife, who was halfway his wife already. Light, all she had to do was say 3 sentences and the thing was done. Burn him, but she was beautiful. Once he had mistaken her for a child, but that had been because of her size, and her face had been obscured by a transparent veil. Without that veil, it was plain that that heart-shaped face belonged to a woman. Her big eyes were dark pools a man could spend a lifetime swimming in. Her rare smiles could be mysterious or mischievous, and he prized them. He enjoyed making her laugh, too, at least when she was not laughing at him. True, she was a little slimmer than he had always preferred, but if he could ever get an arm around her without Solutia there, he believed she would feel just right. And he might convince her to give him a few kisses with those full lips. He dreamed about that sometimes. Never mind that she called him down as if they were really married. Well, almost never mind. Burn him if he could see what a little grease mattered. Lopin and Narim, the 2 serving men he was saddled with, would fight over which one got to clean the coat. They had little enough to do that they really would if he did not name who received the task. He did not say that to her. Women like nothing better than making you defend yourself, and once you started, she had won. I'll try to remember that, Precious, he said with his best smile, sliding in beside Solutia and putting his hat down on the other side from her. The blanket scrunched up between them, and they were a foot apart to boot. Yet you would have thought he had pressed himself against her hip. Her eyes were blue, but the furious look she gave him was hot enough. His coat should have been singed. I hope there's more water than wine in that cup in front of Oliver. It's goat's milk, the boy said indignantly. Ah, well, maybe Oliver was still a little too young even for well-watered wine. Tuan sat up very straight, though she was still shorter than Solutia, who was a short woman herself. What did you call me? She said, as close to crisply as her accent allowed. Precious. You have a pet name for me, so I thought I should have one for you, Precious. He thought Selutia's eyes were going to pop right out of her head. I see, Tuan murmured, pursing her lips in thought. The fingers of her right hand waggled as though idly, and Solutia immediately slid off the bed and went to one of the cupboards. She still took time to glare at him over Tuan's head. Very well, Tuan said after a moment. It will be interesting to see who wins this game, toy. Matt's smile slipped. Game. He was just trying to regain a little balance. But she saw a game, and that meant he could lose. Was likely to, since he had no idea what the game was. Why did women always make things so complicated? Solutia resumed her place and slid a chipped cup in front of him, and a blue-glazed plate that held half a loaf of crusty bread, 6 varieties of pickled olives mounted up, and 3 sorts of cheese. That perked his spirits again. He had hoped for this, if not expected it. Once you got a woman feeding you, she had a hard time finding it in herself to stop you from putting your feet under her table again. The thing of it is, Noel said, resuming his tale, in those Ayad villages, you can see women of any age, but no men much above 20, if that. Not a one. Oliver's eyes grew even wider. The boy practically inhaled Noel's tales about the countries he had seen, even the lands beyond the Aiel Waste, swallowed them whole without butter. Are you any relation to Jane Charn, Noel? Matt chewed an olive and discreetly spat the pit into his palm. The thing tasted not far from spoiling. So did the next one. But he was hungry, so he gobbled them down and followed with some crumbly white goat cheese while ignoring the frowns Tuan directed at him. The old man's face went still as stone, and Matt had torn off a piece of bread and eaten that as well before Noel answered. Cousin, he said at last, grudgingly. He was my cousin. You're related to Jane Farstrider? Oliver said excitedly. His favorite book was The Travels of Jane Farstrider, which he would have sat up reading by lamplight long past his bedtime had Julian and Thera allowed. He said he intended to see everything Farstrider had when he grew up, all that and more. Who is this man with 2 names? Tuan asked. Only great men are spoken of so, and you speak as if everyone should know him. He was a fool, Noel said grimly before Matt could open his mouth, though Oliver did get his open and left it gaping while the old man continued. He went gallivanting about the world and left a good and loving wife to die of a fever without him there to hold her hand while she died. He let himself be...
Give me 1 second, everyone.
Abruptly, Noel's face went blank. Staring through Matt, he rubbed at his forehead as though attempting to recall something. Jane Farstrider was a great man, Oliver said fiercely. His hands curled into small fists, as though he was ready to fight for his hero. He fought Trollocs and Murdrol, and he had more adventures than anyone else in the whole world, even Matt. He captured Cowan Germalan, after Germalan betrayed Malkir to the Shadow. Noel came to himself with a start and patted Oliver's shoulder. He did that, boy. That much is to his credit. But what adventure is worth leaving your wife to die alone? He sounded sad enough to die on the spot himself. Oliver had no answer to that, and his face fell. If Noel had put the boy off his favorite book, Matt was going to have words with the old man. Reading was important. He read himself. Sometimes he did. And he made sure Oliver had books he enjoyed. Standing, Tuan leaned across the table to rest a hand on Noel's arm. The stern look had vanished from her face, replaced by tenderness. A wide belt of dark yellow tooled leather cinched her waist, emphasizing her slim curves. More of his coin spent. Well, coin was always easy to come by for him, and if she did not spend it, likely he would throw it away on some other woman. You have a good heart, Master Charon. She gave everybody their bloody names except for Matt Coffin. Do I, my lady? Noel said, sounding as though he really wanted to hear an answer. Sometimes I think. Whatever he thought sometimes, they were not to learn it now. The door swung open, and Julian put his head into the wagon. The tyrant thief catcher's conical red hat was at its usual jaunty angle, but his dark face was worried. Shan soldiers are setting up across the road. I'm going to Thera. She'll take a fright if she hears it from anybody else. And as quickly as that, he was gone again, leaving the door swinging. Chapter 7. Cold Medallion. Shan soldiers. Blood and bloody ashes. That was all Matt needed, with the dice spinning his head. They'll find Aginin and Warner. Oliver, you won the Aes Sedai, and Bethaman and Seda. Those five would all be together, or at least close by one another. The two former Suldam shadowed the sisters whenever they left the wagon they all shared. Why he hoped none of them had gone into the town again. That could put a weasel in the chicken yard for sure. I'll go down to the entrance and try to see if we're in any trouble. She won't answer to that name, Noel muttered, sliding up from the table. He moved spryly for a fellow who looked to have half the bones in his body broken one time or another. You know she won't. You know who I mean, Matt told him sharply, frowning at Tuon and Selusha. This name foolishness was their fault. Selusha had told Aginin that her name was now Lyle Shipless, and that was the name Aginin was using. Well, he was not about to put up with that sort of thing, not for himself and not for her. She had to come to her senses, soon or late. I'm just saying, Noel said. Come on over. Matt slid off after them, but before he reached the door, Tuon spoke. No warnings for us to remain inside, Toy? No one left to guard us. The dice said he should find Harnin or one of the other Red Arms and plant him outside just to guard against accidents, but he did not hesitate. You gave your word, he said, settling his hat on his head. The smile he got in reply was worth the risk. Run him, but it lit up her face. Women were always a gamble, but sometimes a smile could be win enough. He saw from the entrance that Jorador's days without a Shonchan presence had come to an end. Directly across the road from the show, 700 men were taking off armor, unloading wagons, setting up tents in ordered rows, establishing horse lines. All very efficiently done. He saw Terrabonners with mail veils hanging from their helmets and bars of blue, yellow, and green painted across their breastplates, and men who were clearly infantry, stacking long pikes and racking bows, much shorter than a Two Rivers bow, in armor painted the same. He thought those must be Amadisians. Neither Terrabon nor Altara ran much to foot, and Altarans in service to the Shonchan had their armor marked differently for some reason. There were actual Shonchan, of course, perhaps 20 or 30 that he could see. There was no mistaking that painted armor of overlapping plates or those strange insectile helmets. 3 of the soldiers came ambling across the road, lean, hard-bitten men. Their blue coats, with the collars striped green and yellow, were plain enough despite the colors, and showed the wear of armor use, but no signs of rank. Not officers, then, but still maybe as dangerous as red adders. 2 of the fellows could have been from Andor or Murandy or even the Two Rivers, but the third had eyes tilted like a Saldaean's, and his skin was the color of honey. Without slowing, they started into the show. One of the horse handlers at the entrance gave a shrill 3-note whistle that began to echo through the show, while the other, a squint-eyed fellow named Bolin, pushed the glass pitcher in front of the 3. Price is a silver penny each, Captain, he said with deceptive mildness. Matt had heard the big man speak in the same tone, a heartbeat before he thumped another horse handler over the head with a stool. Children is 5 coppers if they's more than waist high on me, and 3 if they's shorter, but only children as has to be carried gets in free. The honey-skinned Shonchan raised a hand as if to push Bolin out of his way, then hesitated, his face growing harder, if that was possible. The other two squared up beside him, fists clenched as pounding boots announced the arrival of every man in the show, it seemed. Performers in their flashy garb and horse handlers in coarse wool. Every man had a club of some sort in his hand, including Luca in a brilliant red coat embroidered with gold stars to his turned-down boot tops, and even the bare-chested Petra, who possessed the mildest nature of anyone. Petra's head now, though. Like this had the makings of a massacre, with these fellows' companions not 100 paces away and all their weapons to hand. It was a good place for Matt Cawthon to take himself out of. Surreptitiously, he touched the throwing knives hidden up his sleeves and shrugged just to feel the one hanging down behind the back of his neck. No way to check those under his coat or in his boots without being noticed, though. The dice seemed like continuous thunder. He began to plan how to get Tuon and the others away. He had to hang on to her a while longer yet. Before disaster could open the door, another Sean Chen appeared, in blue, green, and yellow striped armor, but carrying her helmet on her right hip. She had the tilted eyes and honey-colored skin, and there was a scattering of white in her close-cropped black hair.
Excuse me.
She was near a foot shorter than any of the other three, and there were no plumes on her helmet, just a small crest like a bronze arrowhead at the front. But the three soldiers stood up very straight when they saw her. "Now why am I not surprised to find you here at what looks to be the fine beginnings of a riot, Miro?" Her slurred accent had a twang in it. "What's this all about, then?" "We paid our money, standard-bearer," the honey-skinned man replied in the same twangy accents. "Then they said we had to pay more on account of us being soldiers of the Empire." Bolin opened his mouth, but she silenced him with a raised hand. She had that kind of presence. Running her eyes over the men gathered in a thick semicircle with their clubs, and pausing a moment to shake her head over Luca, she settled on Matt. "Did you see what happened?" "I did," Matt replied. "And they tried to walk in without paying." "That's good for you, Miro," she said, getting a surprised blink from the man. "Good for all three of you. Means you won't be out your coin, because you're all confined to camp for 10 days, and I doubt this show will be here that long. You're all docked 10 days' pay as well. You're supposed to be unloading wagons so the home folks don't get the idea we think we're better than they are. Or do you want a charge of causing dissension in the ranks?" The three men paled visibly. Apparently that was a serious charge. "I didn't think so. Now, get out of my sight and get to work before I make it a full month instead of a week." "Yes, standard-bearer," they snapped out as one, then ran back across the road as hard as they could go while tugging off their coats. Hard men, yet the standard-bearer was harder. She was not finished, however. Luca stepped forward, bowing with a grand flourish, but she cut off whatever thanks he was about to offer. "I don't much like fellows threatening my men with cudgels," she drawled, resting a free hand on her sword hilt. "Not even Muriel. Not at these odds. Still, shows you have backbone. Any of you fine fellows want a life of glory and adventure? Step across the road with me and I'll sign you up. You there in that fancy red coat. You have the look of a born lancer to me. I'll wager I can whip you into a proper hero in no time." A ripple of head-shaking ran through the assembled men, and some, seeing that no trouble was likely, now began slipping away. Petra was one of those. Luca looked as though he had been poleaxed. A number of others appeared almost as stunned by the offer. Performing paid better than soldiering, and you avoided the risk of people sticking swords into you. "Well, as long as you're standing here, maybe I can convince you. Not likely you'll get rich, but the pay is usually on time, and there's always the chance of loot if the order is given. Happens now and then. The food varies, but it's usually hot, and there's usually enough to fill your belly. The days are long, but that just means you're tired enough to get a good night's sleep. When you don't have to work the night, too. Anyone interested yet?" Luca gave himself a shake. "Thank you, Captain, but no," he said, sounding half strangled. Some fools thought soldiers were flattered by someone thinking they had a higher rank than they did. Some fool soldiers were. "Excuse me, if you please. We have a short pogrom. find people who aren't going to be pleased if they have to wait much longer to see it. With a last wary look at the woman, as if he feared she might try to drag him off by his collar, he rounded on the men behind him. All of you, get back to your stands. What are you doing lounging around here? I have everything well in hand. Get back to your stands before people start demanding their money back. That would have been a disaster in his book. Given the choice between handing back coin and having a riot, Luca would have been unable to decide which was worse. With the show folk dispersing and Luca hurrying away while shooting glances at her over his shoulder, the woman turned to Matt, the only man remaining aside from those two horse handlers. And what about you? From the look of you, you might be made an officer and get to give me orders. She sounded amused by the notion. He knew what she was doing. The people in the line had seen 3 Shan soldiers sent running, and who could say for sure why they had run, but now they had seen her disperse a much larger crowd by herself. He would have given her a place in the band as a bannerman in a breath. I'd make a terrible soldier, standard bearer, he said, using his hat, as she laughed. As he turned away, he heard Bullen saying mildly, You didn't hear what I told that man? It's a silver penny for you and another for your good wife. Coins clinked into the pitcher. Thank you. Things were back to normal, and the dice were still racketing in his head. Making his way through the show, where acrobats were again tumbling for the crowds on their wooden platforms, and jugglers juggling, and Clarine's dogs running atop large wooden balls, and Miora's leopards standing on their hind legs inside a cage that looked barely strong enough to hold them, he decided to check on the Aes Sedai. The leopards brought them to mind. The common soldiers might spend the day working, yet he would have laid coin on at least some of the officers coming for a look before long. He trusted Tuon, strangely enough, and Aginin had enough sense to stay out of sight when there might be other Shan around. But common sense seemed in short supply among Aes Sedai. Even Teslan and Edicina, who had spent time as Damani, took foolish chances. Jolene, who had not, seemed to think herself invulnerable. Everybody in the show knew the 3 women were Aes Sedai now, but their large wagon, covered with rain-streaked whitewash, still stood near the canvas-topped storage wagons not far from the horse lines. Luca had been willing to rearrange his show for a high lady who gave him a warrant of protection, but not for Aes Sedai, who put him at risk with their presence and were practically penniless besides. The women among the show folk were sympathetic to the sisters for the most part, the men wary to one degree or another. It was almost always so with Aes Sedai. But Luca likely would have turned them out to make their own way without Matt's gold. Aes Sedai were more threat than anything else, so long as they were in lands controlled by the Shan. Matt Cawthon got no thanks for it. Not that he was looking for any. He would have settled for a touch of respect, unlikely as that was. Aes Sedai were Aes Sedai, after all. Jolene's warders, Blerick and Fenn, were nowhere to be seen, so there was no need to talk his way past them to get inside, but as he approached the dirt-streaked steps at the back of the wagon, the fox-head medallion hanging beneath his shirt went icy cold against his chest, then colder still. For a moment he froze like a statue. Those fool women were channeling in there. Coming to himself, he pounded up the steps and banged the door open. The women he expected to see were all present. Jolene, a green sister, slender and pretty and big-eyed, and Teslan, a narrow-shouldered red who looked as though she chewed rocks, and Edicina, a yellow, handsome rather than pretty, with waves of black hair spilling to her waist. He had saved all 3 from the Shan, gotten Teslan and Edicina out of the Damani kennels themselves, yet their gratitude was variable, to say the best. Bethamin, as dark as Tuon, but tall and nicely rounded, and yellow-haired Sita had been Suldam before they were forced into helping rescue the 3 Aes Sedai. The 5 of them shared this wagon, the Aes Sedai to keep an eye on the former Suldam to keep an eye on the Aes Sedai. None realized their task, but mutual distrust made them carry it out assiduously. The one woman he had not expected to see was Sitala Anan, who had kept the wandering woman in Abu Dar before she decided to make herself part of that rescue for some reason. But then Sitala had a way of pushing herself in, of meddling, in fact. She meddled between him and Tuon incessantly. What they were doing was completely unexpected, though. In the middle of the wagon, Bethamin and Sita were standing rigid as fence posts, jammed shoulder to shoulder between the two beds that could not be raised against the walls, and Jolene was slapping Bethamin's face again and again, first with one hand, then the other. Silent tears trickled down the tall woman's cheeks, and Sita looked afraid that she would be next. Edicina and Teslin, arms folded beneath their
I
breasts,
definitely
were
gotta
watching
shave
with
here
no
soon.
expression whatsoever, while Mistress Annan frowned her disapproval over Teslin's shoulder. Whether disapproval of the slapping or of what Bethamin had done to earn it, he could not have said and did not care. Crossing the floor in one stride, he seized Jolene's upraised arm and spun her around. "What in the light are you—" That was as far as he got before she used her other hand to catch him a buffet so hard that his ears rang. "Now that killed the goat," he said, and, spots still floating in his vision, he dropped down onto the nearest bed and pulled a surprised Jolene across his lap. His right hand landed on her bottom with a loud smack that pulled a startled squawk from her. The medallion went colder still, and Edicina gasped when nothing happened, but he tried to keep one eye on the other two sisters and one eye on the open door for Jolene's warders, while he held her in place and whacked as fast and as hard as he could. With no idea how many shifts or petticoats she was wearing under that worn blue wool, he wanted to make sure he left an impression. It seemed his hand was beating time for the dice spinning in his head. Struggling and kicking, Jolene began cursing like a wagon driver, as the medallion seemed to turn to ice, and then to grow so cold he wondered if it would give him frostbite. But he soon added wordless yelps to her pungent vocabulary. His arm might not match Petra's, but he was far from weak. Practice with bow and quarterstaff gave you strong arms. Edicina and Teslin seemed as frozen in place as the two wide-eyed former Suldam. Well, Bethamin was grinning, and she appeared as amazed as Sita. But just as he began to think Jolene's yelps were outnumbering her curses, Mistress Annan tried to push past the two Aes Sedai. Astonishingly, Teslin made a peremptory gesture for her to remain where she was. Very few women or men argued with an Aes Sedai's commands, but Mistress Annan gave the Red Sister a frosty look and squeezed between the two Aes Sedai, muttering something that made both of them eye her curiously. She still had to force her way between Bethamin and Sita, and he took advantage of that, a flurry of hard smacks, then rolled the green sister off his lap. His hand had begun to sting anyway. Jolene landed with a thump and let out a gasped, "Oh!" Planting herself in front of him, close enough that she interfered with Jolene's hasty scramble to her feet, Mistress Annan studied him with her arms folded beneath her breasts in a way that increased the generous cleavage displayed by her plunging neckline. Despite the dress, she was not Ebudari, not with those hazel eyes. But she had large golden hoops in her ears, a marriage knife, the hilt marked with red and white stones for her sons and daughters, dangling from a wide silver collar around her neck, and a curved dagger thrust behind her belt. Her dark green skirts were sewn up on the left side to show red petticoats. With touches of gray in her hair, she was every inch the stately Ebudari innkeeper, sure of herself and accustomed to giving orders. He expected her to upbraid him. She was as good as an Aes Sedai when it came to upbraiding, so he was surprised when she spoke, sounding very thoughtful. "Jolene must have tried to stop you, and Teslin and Edicina as well. But whatever they did failed. I think that means you possess a Tirangreal that can disrupt flows of the power. I've heard of such things. Catswain Maligran supposedly had one, or so rumors said. But I've never seen the like. I would very much like to. I won't try to take it away from you, but I would appreciate seeing it." "How do you know Catswain?" Jolene demanded, attempting to brush off the seat of her skirt. The first brush of her hand brought a wince, and she gave over with a glare for Matt just to show him she still had him in mind. Tears glistened in her big brown eyes and on her cheeks, but if he had to pay for them, it was worth the price. "She said something about the test for the shawl," Edicina said. "She did say, how could you have passed the test for the shawl if you freeze at moments like this?" Teslin added. Mistress Annan's mouth tightened for a moment, but if she was discomposed, she regained her poise in a breath. "You may recall that I owned an inn," she said dryly. "Many people visited the Wandering Woman, and many of them talked, perhaps more than they should have." "No Aes Sedai would," Jolene began, then turned hurriedly. Blarick and Fen were starting up the steps. Borderlanders both, They were big men, and Matt quickly got to his feet, ready to use his knives if necessary. They might drub him, but not without bleeding for it. Surprisingly, Jolene darted to the door and shut it tight in Fenn's face, then fastened the latch. The Saldaean made no effort to open the door, but Matt had no doubt the pair of them would be waiting when he left. When she turned around, her eyes were blazing hot, tears and all, and she seemed to have forgotten Mistress Anand for the moment. "If you ever even think of—" she began, shaking a finger at him. He stepped forward and stuck a finger of his own to her nose, so fast that she jumped back and bumped into the door, from which she rebounded with a squeak, spots of red blooming in her cheeks. He cared not a whisker whether that was anger or embarrassment. She opened her mouth, but he refused to let her get a word in edgewise. "Except for me, you'd be wearing a demonic collar around your neck, and so would Edicina and Teslin," he said, as much heat in his voice as there was in her eyes. "In return, you all try to bully me. You go your own way and endanger all of us. You bloody well channeled when you know there are Shonchan right across the road. They could have a demoni with them, or a dozen for all you know." He doubted there was even one, but doubt was not certainty, and in any case, he was not about to share his doubts with her, not now. "Well, I might have to put up with some of that, though you'd better know I'm getting close to my edge. But I won't put up with you hitting me. You do that again, and I vow I'll pepper your hide twice as hard and twice as hot. My word on it." "And I won't try to stop him next time if you do," Mistress Anand said. "Nor I," Teslin added, echoed after a long moment by Edicina. Jolene looked as though she had been hit between the eyes with a hammer. Very satisfactory, as long as he could figure out how to avoid having his bones broken by Blerick and Fenn. "Now, would someone like to tell me why you bloody decided to start channeling like it was the last battle? Do you have to keep holding them like that, Edicina?" He nodded at Sita and Bethaman. It was only an educated guess, but Edicina's eyes widened for a moment as if she thought his Tirangriel let him see flows of the power as well as stop them. In any case, an instant later, both women were standing normally. Bethaman calmly began drying her tears with a white linen handkerchief. Sita sat down on the nearest bed, hugging herself and shivering. She looked more shaken than Bethaman. None of the Aes Sedai seemed to want to answer, so Mistress Anand did it for them. "There was an argument. Jolene wanted to go see these Shonchan for herself, and she wouldn't be argued out of it. Bethaman decided to discipline her, just as if she had no clue what would happen." The innkeeper shook her head in disgust. "She tried to pull Jolene across her lap, with Sita helping her, and Edicina wrapped them up in flows of air. I'm assuming," she said, when the Aes Sedai all looked at her sharply. "I may not be able to channel, but I do use my eyes." "That doesn't account for what I felt," Matt said. "There was a lot of channeling going on in here." Mistress Anand and the three Aes Sedai studied him speculatively. Long stares that seemed to probe for the medallion. They were not going to forget about his Tirangriel, that was for sure. Jolene took up the story. "Bethaman channeled. I've never before seen the weave she used, but for a few moments, until she lost the source, she had sparks dancing all over the three of us. I think she may have used as much of the power as she could draw." Sobs suddenly racked Bethaman. She sagged halfway to falling to the floor. "I didn't mean to," she wept, shoulders shaking, face contorted. "I thought you were going to kill me, but I didn't mean to. I didn't." Sita began rocking back and forth, staring at her friend in horror. Or perhaps her former friend. They both knew Adon could hold them, and maybe any Suldam, but they might well have denied the full import. Any woman who could use an Adon could learn to channel. Likely they had tried as hard as they could to deny that hard fact, to forget it. Actually channeling altered everything, however. Burn him, this was all he needed on top of everything else. "What are you going to do about it?" Only an Aes Sedai could handle this. "Now she's started, she can't just stop, I know that much." "Let her die," Teslin said harshly. "We can keep her shielded until we can be rid of her. Then she can die." "We can't do that," Edicina said, sounding almost shocked, though not apparently at the thought of Bethaman dying. "Once we let her go, she'll be a danger to everyone around her." "I won't do it again," Bethaman wept, almost pleading. "I won't." Pushing past Matt as if he were a coat rack, Jolene confronted Bethaman, staring up at the taller woman with her fists on her hips. You won't stop. You can't, once you begin. Oh, you may be able to go months between attempts to channel, but you will try again and again, and every time your danger will increase. With a sigh, she lowered her hands. You are much too old for the novice book, but there's nothing for it. We will have to teach you. Enough to make you safe, at least. Teach her, Teslin screeched, planting her fists on her hips. I do say let her die. Do you have any idea how these Suldam did treat me when they did have me prisoner? No, since you've never gone into detail beyond moaning over how horrible it was, Jolene replied dryly, then added in very firm tones, but I will not leave any woman to die when I can stop it. That did not end things, of course. When a woman wanted to argue, she could keep it going if she was by herself, and they all wanted to argue. Edicina joined in on Jolene's side, and so did Mistress Hanan, just as if she had as much right to speak as the Aes Sedai. Of all things, Bethaman and Sita took Teslin's part, denying any wish to learn to channel, waving their hands and arguing as loudly as anyone. Wisely, Matt took the opportunity to slip out of the wagon and pull the door shut behind him softly. No need to remind them of him. The Aes Sedai, at least, would remember soon enough. At least he could stop worrying about where the bloody Adam were, and whether the Suldam would try using them again. That was well and truly finished now. He had been right about Blerick and Fenn. They were waiting at the foot of the steps, and storm clouds were not in it for their faces. Without any doubt, they knew exactly what had happened to Jolene. But not who was to blame, it turned out. What went on in there, Cawthon? Blerick demanded, his blue eyes sharp enough to poke holes. Slightly the taller of the two, he had shaved his Shinaran topknot and was not best pleased by the growth of short hair covering his scalp. Were you involved? Fenn asked coldly. How could I have been? Matt replied, trotting down the steps as if he had not a care in the world. She's an Aes Sedai, in case you hadn't noticed. If you want to know what happened, I suggest you ask her. I'm not wolf-headed enough to talk about it, I'll tell you that. Only I wouldn't ask her right now. They're all still arguing in there. I took the chance to slip out while my hide was still intact. Not the best choice of words, perhaps. The two warders' faces grew darker still, impossible as that seemed. But they let him go on his way without having to resort to his knives. There was that. Neither seemed very eager to enter the wagon, either. Instead, they settled on the wagon's steps to wait. More fools they. He doubted Jolene would be very forthcoming with them, but she might well take out some of her temper on them because they knew. Had he been them, he would have found tasks to keep him clear of that wagon for, say a month or two. That might help. Some. Women had long memories for some things. He was going to need to watch over his shoulder for Jolene himself from now on. But it had still been worth it. With Sean Chan camped across the road, and Aes Sedai arguing and women channeling as if they had never heard of the Sean Chan, and the dice spinning in his head, not even winning 2 games of stones from Tuon that night could make him feel anything but wary. He went to sleep on the floor, since it was Doman's turn to use the second bed. Eginin always got the under, with the dice bouncing off the insides of his skull, but he was sure that tomorrow had to be better than today. Well, he had never claimed to always be right. He just wished he was not quite so wrong so often. Chapter 8. Dragon's Eggs. Luca had the chauffeur breaking camp, taking
Alright, everyone, I'm going to call into the stream for tonight. I want to thank everyone for stopping by and excuse me, everyone who came to stop by. I definitely appreciate all y'all's support. Until next time, everyone, y'all stay safe.